Imagine being born into the Ice Age with a body that couldn't run, couldn't hunt, couldn't keep up. In a world ruled by survival of the fittest, you'd expect that life to end fast, quietly, maybe even before it really started. That's the story we've always been told about prehistory. Brutal, unforgiving, no room for weakness. Then scientists found something that completely destroyed that story. In a cave in Spain called Cova Negra, researchers examined a tiny fossilized ear bone belonging to a Neanderthal child. The inner ear had an unusual shape, one that didn't match typical Neanderthal anatomy at all. After careful analysis, the diagnosis was almost impossible to believe. This child, who lived more than 146,000 years ago, had Down syndrome. If you understand what that condition requires even today, with modern medicine and constant monitoring, you understand how staggering this discovery actually is. The symptoms would have included severe hearing loss and serious balance problems, likely making it difficult for this child to walk steadily or communicate easily. Researchers determined the child survived to at least 6 years old. 6 years, not days, not weeks. Years of sustained, intensive care in an Ice Age environment from a species we've spent decades picturing as little more than brutish cave dwellers. One researcher involved in the study put it simply: the level of care this child needed almost certainly exceeded what a single mother could provide alone, which means an entire group, not just one parent, made the deliberate, ongoing choice to keep this child alive. And here's where it gets even more interesting, because this wasn't an isolated case. Roughly 45,000 years ago, a Neanderthal man known to researchers as Shanidar I was missing his lower arm. He was partially blind, partially deaf. He walked with a severe limp that would have made hunting essentially impossible, and he lived into his 40s. In a world without medicine, without safety nets, without anything resembling a hospital, somebody fed this man for decades. Somebody made sure he had shelter. Somebody decided that his life was worth that effort. Now let's jump forward to a cave in Calabria, Italy, somewhere around 12,000 years ago. Archaeologists excavating Romito Cave found something unusual buried there. A young person, barely over 3.5 feet tall, with dramatically shortened arms and legs. For decades, scientists weren't entirely sure what they were looking at. Then, in early 2026, researchers finally extracted DNA from the inner ear bone and confirmed it. This individual had a rare genetic disorder called achromosomtic dysplasia, a severe form of dwarfism that would have made walking long distances, climbing, and basic daily movement profoundly difficult. The remains, now known as Romito II, were buried beside an older woman, almost certainly a close relative, possibly her mother. The two were laid to rest in an embrace. Think about what that detail actually means. This wasn't a quiet, forgotten burial off to the side. This was a body positioned deliberately, intimately, with care that survived 12,000 years for us to still recognize it as care. And the burial itself wasn't bare. It included shell jewelry, red ochre pigment, and was placed beneath an engraving of a bull carved directly into the cave wall, one of the most striking pieces of Ice Age art ever discovered at that site. Researchers studying her remains found no signs of trauma, no neglect, no malnutrition that stood out from anyone else buried nearby. Her community fed her, moved with her, slowed down for her, again and again, for years. This pattern doesn't stop there. At a site called Sunghir in Russia, archaeologists uncovered the graves of 2 children. One had severely bowed legs. The other had a pronounced facial deformity. Neither condition would have made survival easy in a hunter-gatherer world built around mobility and physical labor. And yet both children were buried with something extraordinary: 16 mammoth ivory spears, an object representing what archaeologists estimate to be thousands of hours of skilled labor. Spears that would never be thrown, never used to hunt anything, created purely as an offering, for children whose bodies set them apart from everyone around them. At Dolní Věstonice, in what is now the Czech Republic, archaeologists found a triple burial. One individual showed severe limb abnormalities. A woman at the same site had a visible facial deformation and was buried beneath the shoulder blade of a mammoth covered in red ochre. Here's the detail that should genuinely stop you. Archaeologists also recovered a small clay figurine from that same site, sculpted with the exact same facial deformation as the woman buried there. Someone looked at her, saw what made her different, and chose to immortalize it in art, not hide it, not erase it. So what does this actually tell us? It tells us that the assumption most of us grew up with, that ancient life was a ruthless filter where only the physically perfect survived, simply doesn't match the evidence. Anthropologist April Nowell, who studies these cases, points out that helping the most vulnerable members of a group actually makes deep evolutionary sense. Communities that protected their weakest members weren't acting against survival instincts. They were strengthening the entire group's chances of enduring. There's an ongoing academic debate about how confidently we can call this compassion versus simple, practical cooperation. Scientists genuinely disagree on this point. But here's what isn't up for debate. The bones don't lie about effort. Someone gathered extra food for a person who couldn't hunt. Someone slowed an entire group's travel pace for a child who couldn't walk fast. Someone spent what would have been weeks of labor carving ivory spears for children who would never throw one. That effort had to be deliberate. It had to be chosen again and again by multiple people over years. We like to imagine our ancestors as harsh, efficient, almost mechanical in how they prioritize survival. But the actual physical record left behind tells a very different story. One where a child with Down syndrome lived to see 6 birthdays in an Ice Age cave. Where a one-armed, half-blind man lived into his 40s, surrounded by people who simply refused to let him go. Where a young woman with dwarfism was laid to rest in an embrace, beneath an ochre-painted bull, dressed in shell jewelry someone took the time to make for her. This is the part of human history that doesn't get told nearly often enough. Not because it's less true, because it's less convenient. It doesn't fit the story we tell about brutal, unforgiving prehistory. It tells a different one instead. One where being different didn't mean being abandoned, where vulnerability didn't automatically mean death, where tens of thousands of years before anyone wrote down a single law about how to treat the disabled, people were already doing it quietly, consistently, without anyone asking them to. The next time someone tells you that compassion is a modern invention, a product of soft, comfortable civilization, remember Cova Negra. Remember Shanidar. Remember Romito. Long before there were hospitals, before there were words for any of these conditions, there were people who looked at someone different from themselves and decided without hesitation that they belonged anyway.